your external ear, the cartilage around your ribs, which we call the costal cartilage, meniscuses in your knees, intervertebral discs in the back. Those would all be considered skeletal cartilages that can start to deteriorate with age. Jot that down. And you don't have to write down it, word for word, just so that you understand that these cartilages and bone are going to undergo natural aging changes. Not the bones. This is, when the osteoclasts are breaking the bone down, that's going to make the bones less dense, so more susceptible to fracture. But the cartilage really doesn't have anything to do with the bone tissue itself.
I know.
It just depends. It depends on age. It depends on. There's really not one more common than another. Diana?
There's this person that I met that right here doesn't have like a bone. It's just like squishy.
There is no bone.
Not bone amount. It's like
Cartilage?
Yeah, they go I can't even talk about
Cartilage.
Cartilage.
Huh.
And she said that since she was a baby or whatever, like I don't know what happened since she was younger, she would always mess with it. That's her sort of it. And then,
the whole reason that your nose has structure is because of cartilage.
Yeah, but it has the structure, but you can't feel it. Like it's just squishy.
Huh.
It's weird.
What? That's the only thing that's there. All right. So here's the picture again. Now, ways that we can slow down loss of bone density, and this is one of the more important ones, by making healthy living choices. Number one, weight-bearing exercise, meaning lifting weights. Lifting weights using resistance training pulls on your bones because you're working your muscles and your muscles are attached to your bones. So when we lift weights, we pull on our bones. This act of pulling on the bone forces the osteoblasts to lay down bone tissue, and it helps to make your bones denser. So as we age, the importance of lifting weights becomes even more important. So we think about working out and lifting weights as a young person. Really, that's more cosmetic, honestly, because we're worried about our muscle tone. But as we age, what's important about lifting weights is the benefits that it has on your bone tissue. Making sure that we get enough calcium and enough vitamin D. Vitamin D is manufactured by the liver when the skin is exposed to ultraviolet radiation or sunlight. So getting an adequate amount of sunlight is actually important. You can take vitamin D supplements, and most milk is fortified with vitamin D. So is a lot of orange juice. But nothing beats being in the sun, not excessively, but being in the sun to activate that natural synthetic pathway in your body that will actually manufacture vitamin D. It's very important. So that's something that you should keep in mind. Vitamin D is necessary for your body to absorb calcium. So even if you have a sufficient calcium intake, if you don't have vitamin D, your body's not able to absorb that calcium. Things to avoid as you get older: caffeine, smoking, alcohol, and inactivity. These are all going to work against you. And a lot of this stuff, it's not just because of the effects that it has on your skeletal system. I mean, alcohol, cigarette smoking, caffeine, they have effects on multiple systems. And keep in mind that the cigarette smoking, it's not, with regard to bone density, what really is the chemical that we're most worried about with the cigarette smoke is nicotine. So actually vaping would be more dangerous to your bone health than smoking is, because vapes have more nicotine in them than cigarettes. And I don't think a lot of people realize that. And the nicotine, being a vasoconstrictor, has a lot of negative effects associated with narrowing vessels that supply blood to things like your bone, your brain, your skin. So there's a lot of effects of vaping that people don't talk about because we always think of cigarette smoke and we associate it with lung cancer. Nicotine doesn't cause lung cancer. It's the carbon monoxide and all the other chemicals in cigarettes that actually cause lung cancer. Nicotine has other effects on other parts of the body that can be just as bad. So vaping is actually, from a physiological standpoint, just as bad for you as smoking is, but for other reasons. So, all right, bone disorders that you can be born with or that are congenital. We know that congenital, or we should know that means you're born with it. So there's 3 different types of abnormal curvatures of the spine that we should be aware of. Kyphosis is humpback. It's an abnormal curvature of the thoracic spine. Yeah. Lordosis is swayback. It's an abnormal curvature or exaggeration of the lumbar spine. And scoliosis is, it can affect any part of the vertebral column, cervical, thoracic, or lumbar, and it's an abnormal side-to-side curvature. So, whereas kyphosis and lordosis are exaggerations of an already present curve, scoliosis is a completely abnormal curve that's in the side-to-side direction. So your spine goes this way.
Now, can your like vertebral column collapse? Like we just had, like almost disintegrate?
No, it's not going to collapse on itself just because it's being held in place by other connective tissues. But I mean, an untreated scoliosis is gonna be exceptionally painful, and it's gonna cause physical deformities. You're gonna see it. Yeah. All right. So kyphosis, lordosis, scoliosis. Humpback is kyphosis. Swayback is what normally you would call lordosis, and then scoliosis is just scoliosis. Honestly, the one that's treated, kyphosis is generally the result we're going to talk about in just a second, osteoporosis. Lordosis, I'm not really sure that it's ever treated. Scoliosis is treated by, they put halos, like you see them. Girls that have severe scoliosis, they have like a halo with rods that's screwed into their skull, and they basically keep pulling it up in order to straighten your spine back up. So they drill screws into your skull, and then basically they stretch you so that the spine goes back into alignment.
So how do they keep it in like alignment?
Well, it's a gradual process, and then eventually once you straighten it, it's like a broken bone. It'll stay in alignment. It won't go
I
back.
think I'll do it.
No, it won't. But it's a long process. People with scoliosis.
Yeah, my grandma had kyphosis.
Most old people do.
But she had osteoporosis.
Which we're going to talk about in a little bit. Cleft palate. So we know that studying the skull, so the skull sort of fuses together like this. You have like two plates that come together, because we know that our upper jaw, our maxilla, is actually 2 bones, and it fuses. okay? What happens in a cleft palate situation is the maxilla doesn't fuse together. So we have the nasal cavity and the oral cavity not being separated by the palate because the palate didn't come together. So if the maxilla doesn't come together, then obviously the lip isn't going to form correctly because the upper jawbone never fused together the way it should. So in babies born with cleft palate / cleft lip, what we see immediately is this gap in the upper lip. But that gap is the result of the bone not fusing. And you can see that then when the baby opens the mouth, and you can see that the roof of the mouth is non-existent. The bones haven't come together. So the oral cavity and the nasal cavity are basically one cavity. This is a serious situation because babies can't eat really the right way. They can't suckle. So here in the United States, these conditions are corrected almost immediately. But in other countries, you know, there's kids that can't ever get the surgery. They can't afford the surgery. The surgeries aren't done. And it leads, I mean, it's a very prominent deformity. And it's on the face, so it's very, you know, as far as for someone's self-esteem and things like that. Smiles Across Borders is a program that doctors in the United States donate their time and their expertise to go into third world countries and perform these surgeries on children free of charge, because it is such a I mean, sort of gross deformity. It's actually, I mean,
Could it be prevented?
no, it's common, you know, 1 in 600 births, that's, you know, not uncommon. There's no known cause. It's not because mom ate something at the wrong time in her pregnancy or because there's a gene for it. Cleft palate is completely random. Completely random. It's just a developmental deformity. Yeah. Yeah. It interferes with what? Yep. Because think, I mean, when you breathe, basically you breathe through your nose or you breathe through your mouth. With a baby with cleft palate, when they breathe, it's all like one big cavity. Yeah. Clubfoot. Another congenital bone disorder. No. This is the most common congenital disorder of the lower extremity, 1 out of 1,000. It's when one or both feet are turned downward and inward. So it's like the soles of the feet end up facing each other. And it can be one foot, it can be both feet. The tendons on the inside of the leg are shorter. The bones are misshapen, and the Achilles tendon is very tight. It looks like this. It's mainly idiopathic, meaning no cause, but it can be genetic. So it can both be no connection to genetics whatsoever, just random, but it can be genetic because it is common to find club feet running in families. Yeah, well, they have to do a completely corrective surgery to cut all those tendons, realign the foot, and then you'll wear like a brace for a certain amount of time. So it's mostly idiopathic though. For most of the time, there is no known cause. Again, there can be a genetic component. If a club foot is seen in a parent or a grandparent, then it may occur in subsequent generations, or that may be completely an idiopathic thing, but it can run in families. Yeah. And you're born with this. Congenital, again, this is something you're born with. You don't develop this over time. All right, osteogenesis imperfecta, what we saw yesterday. Either people with OI are born without the proper collagen within their bone tissue, or it's an substandard type of collagen. The quality is very, very low. you know, we know that it leads to very, very, very fragile bones. There's several different types of OI ranging in severity. So, you know, the JoJo kid, the Alaskan kid on the film yesterday, he looked relatively normal. I mean, obviously he was undergoing treatment, but you know, he could walk and he looked a relatively normal height. Whereas Sean, the 23-year-old, was severely deformed. You know, obviously, his growth had been significantly stunted. So there are varying degrees of OI. There is no cure. It is genetic. It's caused by a mutation on the number 17 chromosome. And it can only be treated. It will never be cured. So.
Is there any that prevent?
It's a mutation. Can't prevent it. No, it's a mutation on the number 17 chromosome. You know, the earlier it's diagnosed, which now, I mean, I'm sure it's diagnosed relatively early. The sooner it's diagnosed, the sooner you can start, you know, getting treatment for it. But there's nothing you can do to slow them. I mean, it's your DNA. Your DNA is mutated. You can't fix it. Fair. So this is, again, a collagen disorder. It's a disease where the collagen is not right. And the reason that it can be so debilitating is there's collagen in so many different structures in the body, not just bone. You know, there's collagen in all of your connective tissues. There's collagen in your skin. So that's the reason severe cases of OI are so, cause such gross deformities just because collagen is so abundant in the body. All right, let's go to degenerative bone disorders. So this means that these occur over time. Osteoporosis is discussed in your case study. This is the most common. This is a loss in bone density, and it's a natural part of aging. It's much more common in women. Men very rarely suffer from severe osteoporosis, whereas women are going to be at a greater risk. One reason has to do with estrogen levels in women. Once women go through menopause and the ovaries stop producing estrogen, there seems to be, there is a connection between estrogen levels and bone loss. So as estrogen levels go down, bone loss increases, which is why we see osteoporosis sort of being prevalent in women over 50. That doesn't mean that women younger than 50 can't develop it. My mom developed it at a very young age because she had a large tumor on her ovaries. So they had to take both of her ovaries out when she was 40. And as a result of taking her ovaries out, she no longer produced estrogen. And she ended up fracturing her hip when she was 42. And when she fractured the hip, the doctors realized that she basically had the bones of about a 70-year-old. Because the ovaries had been removed and she was no longer producing estrogen, her bone loss had accelerated. Kyphosis is a main sign of osteoporosis because as the vertebrae start to weaken, that normal curve in your thoracic spine becomes exaggerated. So when you see the little old ladies walking around, grandma, aunts, whatever, with that humpback, it's because they have osteoporosis. This is a electron micrograph of healthy bone tissue. This is osteoporotic bone tissue. So if we look at them side by side, you can see the amount of degeneration. So the bones become less dense. So we can see here a normal bone, more bone tissue. I mean, it's obviously, we can see the trabeculi. This would be spongy bone. So spongy bone being found at the extremities or the epiphyses of long bones and in all of your irregular and flat bones, which is why we see breaks as the result of osteoporosis, most common in the vertebral column and on the ends of long bones like in the hip. So when the spongy bone starts to look like that, the epiphyses of the femur is one of the places that we have a lot of spongy bone. Obviously, if it's osteoporotic, it's much weaker, which is why a hip fracture is very common in individuals, women mostly, that have osteoporosis. Because this is the part that has the spongy bone. This ends up looking like the photomicrograph on the right, becomes very weak, so you can simply, fall on the ice and you're gonna fracture your hip. When people say they break their hip, they don't mean this. They don't mean their hip bone. They mean they generally break off the head of the femur. That's what's actually broken, but they don't call it a femur fracture. They call it a hip fracture because it's the part of the femur that's forming the hip joint. So what they do in a hip replacement is they have a titanium ball on the end of a rod, and they hammer it into, so they take this off, they hammer the ball into the femur, and then you have a titanium head to your femur, a joint. Sometimes in order to reinforce it too, they'll take a rod and they'll tap it down through the medullary cavity, pop, 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 pop. They only last about 20 years. My mom, like I said, she had a hip replacement when she was 42. She ended up having to get another one when she was like 64, because they only last about 20 years. And then you have to get another one.
What's that, like, it looks like it's broken right there in the normal one. That's how I was confused at first.
Yeah, I mean, trabeculi, it's sort of, they're not perfect. It's just like this meshwork of bone. But on the osteoporotic one, not only are the trabeculi becoming degenerative, but you can also see that the openings are much more exaggerated in the picture on the right. Here's a close-up picture showing that spongy bone being eroded. So it's literally being eaten away by osteoclasts. So any place where we have more spongy bone than compact bone, this is where you're gonna be more susceptible to fractures. So like all your vertebrae are mostly spongy bone, so they're one of the first ones to be vulnerable. Your hip joints, obviously, very vulnerable to fracture. Shoulders, a lot of old women will fall and hit their thing, they'll break their shoulder. Oh, go.
Every time most of the time when I go down, I can hear the
That's likely, it's synovial fluid. It's the fluid that lubricates the joint popping. It's like when you pop your knuckles.
Yeah.
That's not your bones popping. That's the fluid that's lubricating the joint popping, like the fizzing of a soda when you pour it, the bubbles of carbon dioxide. Bubbles, there's tiny bubbles in the synovial fluid of your joints, and when you move, those bubbles will pop, and that's what you hear.
Is it bad to crack this one?
Nah, some say yes, some say no. I don't think that no. I don't think so. This is just showing a compression fracture on a vertebrae. All right, bone infection. This is in your handout, osteomyelitis. This is an infection of the bone or the bone marrow. Most common bacteria found in osteomyelitis is staph. So Staphylococcus aureus, including MRSA, which is methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus. It's an antibiotic-resistant form of staph, very dangerous. And we're seeing more of these types of infections, especially with people that are in the hospital having like hip replacements, surgeries, stuff like that. Very serious. What happens is the bacteria is in the bloodstream and then it moves to the bone. It can be spread from other areas of localized infection, but it's very, very commonly introduced during joint replacements. If you have an open fracture where you bust something, you break a bone and the bone penetrates the skin, now you've got to wait for the bacteria to get in. Root canals can introduce bacteria into the bone of the jaws to cause osteomyelitis. The reason that fractures and root canals, Staphylococcus aureus is everywhere. You have bazillions of staph bacteria on your body all the time. All the time. In fact, most of the time if you get like an infection, like after you've cut yourself and you notice that it's infected, it's because of staph. Staph is the most common bacterial infection that's introduced like from the outside that you're gonna have. Problem is now a lot of staph bacteria do not respond to antibiotics. So 30 years ago, you get a staph infection, you could take penicillin and the infection goes away. But now, because of the overuse and misuse of antibiotics, a lot of these bacteria don't respond to treatment anymore. So if you get a resistant form of staph, you could be in big trouble. The only way that they're gonna stop it is by taking large chunks of infected tissue out. They just start cutting pieces away. Top risk factor for osteomyelitis is diabetes. Has to do with circulation. Treatment of this can be pretty intense. Generally, oral antibiotics aren't going to do it. You have to have IV antibiotics for weeks, maybe months. It can result in necrotic bone disease or necrotic tissue disease, again, where tissue starts dying and then it just has to be cut away. So it could look like this. And again, if it's an antibiotic resistant form of staph or strain of staph, then you're gonna have chunks cut out. It's nasty. I had 2 friends of my family, older people, that went in for joint replacements that ended up with MRSA, and it was pretty nasty. Okay, bone disorders that have to do with nutrition. There's several of these. A vitamin D deficiency is called rickets in little kids. In adults, it's called osteomalacia. If you have a vitamin D deficiency, obviously you're not going to be able to absorb calcium, regardless of how good your intake of calcium is. And we need vitamin D to absorb calcium from the food that we eat. If we don't have enough vitamin D, we're not going to get enough calcium, and that's going to lead to things like green stick fractures in little kids. A green stick fracture is when a bone breaks along one side but not the other, like a green stick. Like, you try to break a twig and it only like splinters. The fracture looks exactly the same way, that's why it's called the green stick fracture. And deformities like bow legs. The bones become soft. What? Some, yeah. Again, vitamin D, sunlight, fortified milk. Those at high risk for developing rickets are breastfed infants whose moms are vitamin D deficient, infants who are not exposed to sunlight, or individuals that have basically a deficient diet that aren't getting enough dietary vitamin D. It's pretty rickets actually is not that uncommon in a lot of parts of the world. If you ever watch those documentaries on like the kids in Africa or stuff, a lot of them are bow-legged, they have rickets. That's what they have. It's just a vitamin D deficiency. It's completely the result of diet, completely preventable. So this is what rickets looks like. Lumpy joints, bow legs, curved bones, and it's just because of the lack of calcium in the bone. They're soft, bones are soft. Calcium is needed to harden the bones, so the bones they're just soft. Scurvy is vitamin C deficiency. Vitamin C is necessary for collagen synthesis, so a lack of vitamin C leads to lack of collagen production. If it's untreated, you're gonna die. However, it's very easily reversible by just consuming vitamin C. It's very rare that people die of scurvy now. It used to be really common with sailors who would be on ships because they wouldn't have vitamin C. And then they realized that if they just carried oranges and other citrus fruits with them on their voyages, they could avoid getting scurvy. It's pretty nasty looking. You get swollen joints. Bleeding gums is the #1 sort of sign that people think of usually when they think of scurvy. Bleeding from other mucous membranes like your eyes. Opening of healed scars, because again, the collagen, scars are made of collagen mostly, and if you don't have enough collagen being manufactured in your body, scars can start opening up. It's actually a really yucky disease. It looks like this.
Why do they call it scurvy?
I don't know. Now, scurvy's only seen now in like elderly people that have very bad diets, maybe that aren't eating the way they should. Alcoholics can get scurvy just because they generally have a very, very poor diet, and people that are malnourished.
Guys, where did that person go?
Yeah, they do. And we'll talk about bone cancer on Monday. So I'm done talking for today.